but a small college that I am the only hydrogeologist. I'm the only hydrologist on the entire campus. And so now I do everything. I'm not a groundwater researcher anymore. I am now, if anyone has any question about water for anything, they come to me. So I'm going to talk about kind of the breadth of the work that I'm doing at Fort Lewis and the breadth of my interests. So I'm not just a researcher. I do work at a teaching college. So education is a big passion of mine. Teaching is a big passion of mine. So I'm also going to talk a little bit about my teaching path. Got it. Great. And so I'm calling myself the Jacqueline of all trades. I started writing. You?
I'm trying.
No, you're yeah, so I'm calling myself the Jacqueline of all trades. I started writing Jack of all trades when I was writing the title. And I'm not a Jack, I'm a Jacqueline. So I'm going to talk a little bit about all the different hands that I have in different things. If you came to this talk wanting to hear about a research project of mine for 45 minutes, I'm sorry to tell you, I'm not going to be talking about a specific research project. I'm going to talk more about my path and what I'm doing at Fort Lewis and a bunch of my different interests. So a little bit about me. I grew up near Tulsa, Oklahoma. I actually grew up on Cherokee Nation on the reservation and then moved to Tulsa when I was in high school. And I grew up playing sports, really interested in arts and crafts. I was kind of the kid that would come home constantly and have I was kind of the kid that would come home constantly and have a new thing that I was into. I'm sure my parents loved that. And when I was in high school, my thing I was really interested in was mountains and mountain sports. And so I told my parents, I need to leave Tulsa, I need to leave Oklahoma, and I want to go to the mountains. And I want to rock climb, I want to basically do every sport. I want to be a rap guide, I want to do all the things. And they gave me the sad truth that we did not have the money for me to move to Colorado and be a student in Colorado. And so I was talking to my guidance counselor in high school, and I was telling her my saga, my sad tales about how the mountains were calling me and I couldn't go. And she told me about Fort Lewis College. So Fort Lewis College offers a Native American tuition waiver. So any student from a federally recognized tribe can go to Fort Lewis College tuition free. I Googled Fort Lewis College, and this is about the picture that popped up. And I said, okay, I'm sold. I'm going to Fort Lewis College. And little did I know how much that really was going to shape the rest of my life and my passions. So at Fort Lewis College, I kind of like with my sports growing up, I was in every single major. I was an art major, I was an anthropology major, I was a sociology major, and I was really dipping around in the humanities. And that's because when I was in high school, I was really driven and I did physics. I was in the IB program, AP program for physics, biology, chemistry, and I was over it. I wanted nothing to do with being in the lab. I wanted to be outside. I wanted to be talking with people, exploring things. And I was actually on Thanksgiving break with my cousin, and we were driving to Denver to see his family. And he said, geology is really cool. You get to be outside all the time. And I said, okay, I'm sold. So I became a geology major. And here's a picture of me from 2010 when I was a senior at Fort Lewis. And I also wasn't really actually interested in rocks that much, but I realized I was really interested in water, what lived in the rocks. So this is a picture of me. I installed that groundwater monitoring valve there. And I'll talk actually a little bit about that project later. But I installed groundwater monitoring, was talking with managers about how to better manage the dam for better groundwater recharge, for the riparian vegetation. And I was instantly hooked. I said, this is the type of science I want to do. So I did this project for a year, and then I realized I needed to go make money. So I went into the oil field for 4 years, and I worked for an oil and gas company. And actually the company I worked for was super amazing. Everyone there loved their job. It was kind of like one of those new age tech companies where you have a garden and you have intramural sports and you have a fitness gym and a cafeteria. And it was amazing. Everyone loved their job, and this is about how I felt when I was there. So I realized that industry was not for me. I wanted to do something where I was connecting with people. And I actually sent an email to my professors at Fort Lewis, and I said, "You really seem to like your job. How do you get your job?" And they told me, I was telling these guys over here, they told me, "You need to go get a PhD." And I said, "Okay." So I realized that means that I was graduate school bound, that I needed to go get a PhD so I could be a professor. This is actually also a picture of me from undergrad. So something I was heavily involved with when I was at Fort Lewis was a program called DRAMS Project, which models itself after Engineers Without Borders, and essentially builds sustainable water systems and sanitation systems in developing countries. And I thought it was so cool that my professors got to do all this nerdy brain stuff, and then also in the summers go take students and do stuff like this. So I thought this was kind of the perfect combination of things for me. I could help people work with the environment, still do research, still be nerdy, but get to travel cool places and do cool things. So I always say that water is what brought me to the desert. So I essentially Googled, from this experience and this experience, I was like, water seems pretty cool. Maybe I'll study water. And I just Googled what are the top water programs in the country, and U of A came up. So I said, okay, I think I need to go there. And so I applied to the U of A. I actually had a GRFP that I applied for prior to coming to school. So I was, like I said, to those of you who were here earlier, I was a little bit of a lost puppy. I knew what I needed to get a PhD. I had funding, but I had no idea what I wanted to do. So I got in touch with a bunch of different people on campus. I said, I have this funding, please accept me. They said, okay. And I actually started in the environmental science program. And my first semester, I took graduate level organic chemistry and microbiology. And I decided that maybe this wasn't the program for me, and eventually landed in the hydrology and atmospheric sciences department. And I got my PhD actually in environmental science. Ty was my advisor because he's joint in both departments, and then later transferred over. The Sloan Foundation, I had a Sloan Foundation Fellowship for my master's and my PhD, so they helped fund me also during my studies. And so I walked away from the U of A with 4 pieces of paper. I came away with 2 graduate certificates, so one in connecting science and decision making, one in college teaching, and then I got my MS in environmental science and my PhD in hydrology. So with these 4 pieces of paper, I'm walking away from the U of A feeling pretty on fire. This is what I felt like. And because the thing was, those 4 pieces of paper weren't just pieces of paper, they really reflected my interests and what I wanted to do with my life. And so I'm going to break the top into those 4 interests and just talk about kind of how this works into my Jacqueline of all trades. So science communication, so how can we take the science, the really cool science that we do, and communicate it to the public? Using science to inform management decisions. So getting that kind of goes along with science communication, but how can we get the information that we use into the hands of people that can use it and make decisions based on it? Community-based research, which is something that I've really kind of developed more since going to Fort Lewis. Fort Lewis is a school of 3,500 students. It's in a town of about 20,000 people. So it's a very small community. And you basically talk to anyone in the community, and they're really mostly interested in your research if it's something that is in the walls of the community. They want it to give back to them. So really focusing on the community with the research and then educate them. So that's that college teaching certificate. I've always been driven to take the knowledge that I'm learning, find ways to communicate it to students, and give them the tools they need to further their careers. And Fort Lewis College was the place that I felt like I could do all of those things. So these are all my passions, and for me, it always felt like Fort Lewis was the place that I wanted to go back to and use this. And lucky for me, in fall 2019, I got my dream job at Fort Lewis College. and was able to, start this journey of finding ways to work all these concepts and pieces of paper into one career. So like I said, I'm going to go through these different ones. So I'll start with informing management. So using research to inform management decisions. And this is something that is very familiar to me because I worked with Ty for 5 years, and that's kind of one of his things, is using modeling and using kind of the more scientific research to connect to decision makers and use it to make decisions. So here's just some pictures from my time at the U of A and some of the different projects I had hands in. So I worked with organizations like the Arizona Land and Water Trust, who the idea behind the trust is to find ways to work with landowners, so with ranchers, to reduce their water use, but not put them out of business, right? So find ways to subsidize them for them to reduce their water use for the health of streams in the nearby area. And so what they needed from researchers is how can we tell what kind of difference we're making in this community? So how can we monitor the field to see what kind of water reduction we're doing and if it's making a difference in stream health? So I helped design data collection networks for those kinds of decisions. Also down here, I worked with the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, PNNL. This down here is a waste cover that they're using to try to do contaminant management. So when they have a big kind of waste site, they have to limit water going on to those contaminants so it doesn't mobilize. So they create these covers and then do lots of monitoring on the covers to figure out the effectiveness of it. So anywhere from small nonprofit, hardly any money, scrounging what we can, to these large scale, government agencies or government kind of science collaborations to figure it out. And then also on the right, I got the opportunity to go to Japan under my NSF fellowship and work with Saga University there and figure out, help them better design for irrigation on rice paddy fields. And so looking at how kind of soil moisture sensors or temperature sensors can we use on these complex soils to better manage for irrigation. So this is something that's always kind of been of interest to me. And so whenever I was in my last year of my PhD, I was at a conference and I was talking about all of this work that I was doing. And the one of the researchers from USDA comes up to me and says, "Hey, can you do this for me?" So that researcher was Kendall DeJong. He works up in Fort Collins at the research farm, and essentially he wanted to collaborate with me and figure out best irrigation practices and sensor management for their farms up in Greeley. And so we recently published a paper about 6 months ago on this work. So I'm going to kind of walk through the work a little bit. Like I said, this might just be a tease for you. I'm not going to go in depth on all the things, but I just want to give you an idea of all the different things that I do. So kind of the main question is, how can we use computational modeling to work with managers to optimize data collection strategies? So how can we use kind of this more low cost but high brain work for Melissa, but how can we use this modeling approach to work with managers and design ways to collect data that's more efficient for them? And then really my question is, can we adapt this large scale study? The USDA has tons of money. They're doing lots of monitoring. Can we adapt this for the little guy? So how can we take what we learn from these really large scale research projects and adapt it for the everyday farmer or everyday person that's doing irrigation on their field? So kind of the basic idea, I'm not going to do too much background, but what you need to know about this research is that this is where plants are happy in the field capacity, when the soil is at field capacity. So that's kind of the happy water content for an irrigation field, and farmers are trying to work for their fields to be as close to field capacity as possible. It's okay if it drops a little bit below, but if it's too far below, that's what the plant starts to look like. It's not very happy. And so what farmers and ranchers and different people doing irrigation on their fields or researchers at the USDA, they really want to know about the soil water deficit. So the soil water deficit is in between here. How much water do we need to bring it from the stressed environment up to field capacity? So it's this number that gives them kind of an idea of we need to irrigate X amount to bring the plants back to field capacity. And so that's kind of the goal of all the USDA research is trying to get at this soil water deficit value. And so what they have been doing is at 48 different sites over a 7-year time period. So up here, it has the years and then the different sites, the different rows of sites. They have to rotate fields so they don't exhaust one field over a large period of time, but they're doing the same type of research on both fields. Is they install soil moisture sensors so neutron probe sensors at 6 different depths, and then a TDR probe at the surface. And they're essentially every orange dot in that yellow square at the top has this installed into it. So ignore that for now, but just the neutron probe too. So they have lots of data, essentially, is what you can gather from this. So 48 fields over 7 years, they're doing research looking at soil moisture and essentially trying to calculate what is the soil water deficit of these fields and how do we play with it? How do we manage irrigation so that we know how close can we get to water stress and then how much soil water deficit or what is that value to get it back to a happy medium? And then really the question from my research was, can we get the same information, so soil water deficit, can we get the same information using less sensors? So this is the number of sensors they were using before, and the question was, do we need 7 depths at 2 locations for each field do we need all these data? And so can we install just maybe 1 sensor or 2 sensors and get the same amount of information? And so it's funny when I show this to my students, they're like kind of hyperventilate a little bit, but I will walk you through it. So the basic idea is using linear regression to use the robust data set and then slowly back it away and see what we can gain from that information. So previously they had, like I said, 7 depths and they calculated the soil water deficit using information from those 7 depths. My question is, we know what the goal is, we know the soil water deficit number, but can we use a linear regression and maybe water content at 1 or 2 locations, then use different variables combined with those water content values to calculate the soil water deficit? And so this was kind of a rundown of what the results look like. So this is doing linear regressions for 7 years for 48 sites using different combinations of sensors. And so the black dots are with 2 sensors, the red dots are with 1 sensor. And so what these are showing down here is how accurately we were able to get the soil water deficit using just the information from 1 or 2 sensors. And so you can see over here, these are the ones that scored the best. So this is how closely, R squared is how close the soil water deficit was from the 7 depth value. And then it kind of decreases. 1 sensor at 200 centimeters doesn't give us much information about soil water deficit. And Kendall and I were really interested in how can we make this as simplest as possible. 1 sensor, solid at 1 depth, how well will it do? And so we picked 30 centimeters, that's the one that scored the best. And overall, for most sites, it scored relatively well. And so the next thing, which I got most excited about, was I talked him into trying it out. So we didn't stop there. We installed a sensor at 30 centimeters and collected data. And we also kept the 7 depths as, to compare it to. And we said, how well is this going to work? So down here in 2020, we installed just 1 sensor at 30 centimeters at 2 locations in 2 fields to try to compare it to the 7 depths. And the good news is it worked. So The black dots are the soil water deficit, so time on the x-axis, soil water deficit, so what we calculated either from 7 or 1 sensor. The dots are from the neutron probe. So the neutron probe is calibrated, they've been using it for a long time. It's very, very accurate for water content. However, the unfortunate thing is it's manual. You have to go out and you have to take a measurement every time. So every orange dot in this figure, someone had to walk to that site and take water content measurement. Whereas for the sensor we installed, it was a continuous soil moisture sensor. Little less accurate, but no one has to go out there until the very end, the end of that line, and take the data off the data logger. And so that's why we get a line for the data that we collected using the 30 centimeters. So the line is the one we collected, the soil water deficit that we calculated using that 30 centimeter depth, and then the dots are the neutron probes. And the difference between full and deficit irrigation, like I said, they're out here at these farms trying to figure out how can we irrigate, how can we use less water. So full irrigation is a kind of a traditional irrigation scheme where it starts to get below the field capacity and they just instantly, add water to it and bring it back up. Whereas the deficit irrigation is they kind of let the plant stress a little bit longer and then apply it. But what we find is that for both irrigation strategies, even though the soil moisture, the way that it is in the profile is very different between the two, the 30 centimeters works for both cases. And so this isn't just, something that works when you irrigate in one specific way. This is actually something that works for a wide range of conditions, which is pretty cool. And like I said, my big question is, okay, that's all great. This is a cool journal article that we can publish and a couple people will read, but how do I adapt it for the little guy, right? So if I wanted to do this presentation for a farmer, what could they gain from it and use? And so started kind of trying to create graphs like this, which is showing, so this is all of the data from all of the years. There was lots of different soil types and conditions. And what I noticed when plotting it is that you actually get a trend that they don't change very much based on their slope, but their y-intercept is very different depending on what kind of soil you have. And so that I was like, oh, that means that the soil type controls the y-intercept. And so I created a graph like this that I'm communicating with farmers about. If you can just install one soil moisture sensor at 30 centimeters and get the water content, I can help you figure out how much you need to irrigate to bring it back to field capacity. And so if they know that they have a water content of 20%, 0.2, then, and they know they have a loam on their field, then they can go up to here and say, okay, I need to put about 30 millimeters of water into the soil in order to bring it back to field capacity. So having kind of this visual, this one takeaway that can be translated to a lot of different audiences, it's also just kind of a cool trend in addition. So in terms of research, it's also cool, but just having, something that can be taken away and used for management. So I'm super excited about this. I think this is really cool research. This is about how my students feel about it. They're a linear regression, what? Computational modeling, what? Most of them, they take calculus as part of their degree, but it's at the very, very end, like they push it as far as they can, and then they're in the math center every single day. Yeah.
So how much per sensor?
What?
How much per single sensor?
Cost? What? It's like a couple $100. Yeah, so pretty reasonable. Yeah, good question. Yeah, so they all kind of are not as into this research as I am. So that's really where this community-based research comes in. So trying to find research that informs management that's more interest to my students. Those of you that don't know, Durango is in southwestern Colorado, so where the green star is, it is at the foothills of the San Juans. And so some of you might be familiar with the Telluride, Silverton, Ouray area. If you aren't familiar, I encourage you just to Google it and look at pictures. It's amazing, really beautiful high mountain. And so because of this, because of our location, Durango is down here just south of there. Because of our location, there's a lot of research in the snow world. All my students want to do snow science because when they think of water, they think of snow. And it only took a couple of semesters of them asking and me turning them down that I realized that I'm going to be at Fort Lewis for a couple decades. I probably should learn how to do snow science. So, you know, my interest isn't just in the snow itself, but kind of what happens to the snow after when it melts and goes back into the system. So I'm kind of involved in 3 different local projects, and they're all pretty fresh to me. So I'm sorry if they're a little vague, but the first being in high alpine research. So up in the mountains, around 14,000 feet actually, is where a couple of our study sites are, looking at the snowpack and the changing snowpack up there. So this is a collaboration with the Environmental Science Department, the BLM. So the BLM actually approached the Environmental Science Department saying, we don't know anything about the basins at 14,000 feet. We actually sometimes graze sheep up there, and there's permits to graze sheep up there, but that's all we know about it. And so I got a grant through the USDA to hire a couple student interns. We kind of started the initial assessment of these basins. So looking at what kind of materials are there. We started doing monitoring the soil moisture, looking at snowpack trends, using aerial imagery, and also installing equipment. So this is really brand new to me, but this is the kind of thing that my students get really excited about. They weren't so excited about the USDA research on the computer, but when I show them a picture and say, do you want to hike around here all summer? They get a little more excited. So here is one of my student interns doing some soil analyses and then some infiltration tests up in the basin. I'm really excited to see what comes of this collaboration, but like I said, it's very preliminary. Also doing some snow research a little closer to the home. So San Juan high alpine research is up here, Durango being down here. It's all part of the same watershed. So the water that melts from the mountains in those high alpine basins eventually makes its way into the NMS River. So, you know, it's not all that information is useful, but also trying to understand, okay, what does happen to it after it leaves the mountain? And so this is a collaboration with Colorado Mesa University, Colorado State University, and then now Fort Lewis College. I haven't updated the map yet, so the square is where Fort Lewis College study sites are. The black are where the CSU ones are, and then these purple ones are the San Juan study sites that are run by Colorado Mesa. And the idea is to look at different snow zones and understand how the water goes from this, the snowpack down into the river system. And so kind of it breaks it into 3 snow zones: the persistent snowpack, so where you see snow most of the year, so like I said, this high alpine basin. Transitional, so what happens into between the persistent before it gets down into the river system, that's the intermittent underneath the little bar down there. So there's the intermittent snowpack. So what happens to it in this transitional zone? So once it melts, and then once it becomes runoff, it gets into smaller streams, and eventually into the Animas River. What happens to it in between? And what's going to happen to it with the changing climate? So this is something I actually Gigi Richard is a professor previously at Colorado Mesa and then came down to Fort Lewis. She handed it off to me and retired happily. So this is something I just got into a couple of months ago, but I do have 2 students working on this project. So here's a picture of them at the transitional zone. They're doing stream discharge measurements, soil moisture, snowpack monitoring. They're essentially doing the water budget for the small watershed and then looking at it over time. So we have 3 years of data and we're only getting more. So this is another type thing where, you know, I show a picture to these lovely ladies and they say, sure, sign me up. I want something to do with that. So it's been a fun project to get involved with them. And then the last one that I've been working on actually since here is in 2010, I was talking to one of the really ecologists on campus, and she was saying, I study riparian vegetation along the Dolores River, but I really think it's heavily, controlled by the groundwater. But I have no way to prove that. And then me, as ambitious 20-year-old me, said, well, let's try to figure it out. So I helped her install groundwater monitoring wells along the Dolores River to try to understand how the effects of the dam upstream were changing the groundwater downstream. So the different releases that they were releasing from the dam, how is that recharging the aquifers? Was it recharging it effectively? And then how is that impacting the riparian vegetation? And so this is actually a map that I dug up from my senior thesis when I was at Fort Lewis. And down here at the bottom is McPhee Reservoir, so that's where the dam was. When I was at Fort Lewis, I installed 3 groundwater monitoring wells at a point bar upstream of the dam, 3 groundwater monitoring wells slightly downstream from the dam, and then 3 more quite a ways downstream of the dam to try to, and then I monitored the groundwater throughout the 2 years that I was there and used those data to write my research project. The cool thing is I did all the hard work. So I drove all these pipes into the ground, and then my professors said, thank you for doing that. We'll continue to use these for the next 12 years. So when I came back to Fort Lewis, I already had this 12-year data set from the Dolores River and have since gotten my students involved along the Dolores River. We've installed more groundwater monitoring sites. We started doing stream discharge, and I teach every summer. I teach a field camp and involve the Dolores River somehow in the camp. So this has been kind of probably the most fun project for me to work on. One, I'm more familiar with this information, but also it's cool to see. I always tell them, you never know, your senior thesis project might be something that you do 12 years later. And this project also combines a lot of my passion. So it's community-based. The Dolores River isn't too far from Durango. We're actually using the research to help managers to inform them on best ways to manage the dam for recharge of the groundwater. And also I'm working on this science communication piece on how to get this information to the community and to those managers. And that's where the DRAMS project comes in, stands for Dolores River Adaptive Management Support Group. And I threw all of these affiliations up here because it basically to me shows there are a lot of people interested in the Dolores River. And there's a lot of agencies that are looking at how to monitor the Dolores River for just a healthier ecosystem downstream. And the DRAMS project was really actually come out from a grant that the idea was to how can we manage it specifically for native fish species. So that's kind of the research aim, is looking at managing it and using that through the lens of hydrology, so the groundwater research, the geomorphology, so looking at how the river has changed over time, and then the riparian vegetation. So there's actually a group of scientists that are all working collaboratively on the Dolores River, trying to help get information on how to best manage the dam. And like I said, I'm working on the science communication piece. So this is the link for a website that I have started with some student interns the last couple of years. And the idea behind this website is I want someone who doesn't know much about science to be able to go to this website and understand the research that we're doing along the Dolores. And so there's a lot of imagery and then very specific verbiage on the side of it explaining it. I do a lot of things where I get aerial imagery. So in the geomorphology section, I could talk about the channel width changing over time, or side channels changing over time, or more mid-channel bars or less mid-channel bars. But the everyday person coming to this would see that and just see a block of text with a bunch of words they don't know and continue on their merry way. So the goal is when they come to the Dolores River website or the DRAMS project website, that they look at it and they say, oh, I think I can understand this. So using a lot of visuals to communicate that, doing things like, here's the groundwater project that I've been doing, and creating animations that show the groundwater level changing over time, and then having text that explains what the implications of that are. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is my passion for education. And so I came to Fort Lewis College because I was really interested in undergraduate education. And not to mention, education is my job at Fort Lewis. So I was telling them, I was telling Ty earlier, our provost likes to remind me every year that my job is to educate. Yes, I'm a researcher. Yes, I get to do involved with all this cool stuff, but I work at a teaching college. My job is to educate. And so this is actually my biggest passion, so it's good news for me. And so in the summer of 2019, like I said, I got a degree in subsurface hydrology from this amazing program. I have lots of teaching enthusiasm. I got my dream job at Fort Lewis. Like, there is nothing stopping me from being the world's greatest groundwater educator. Except for in the fall of 2019, this is what my classroom looked like. I was teaching subsurface hydrology to a bunch of undergrads who were actually pretty frustrated, and I was just at a loss as to how to communicate this information to them. And some of their complaints in their evaluations was that hydrology is hard, that the textbooks were super dense and hard to understand, that the concepts were just way too complex for them to wrap their heads around, and they really were craving for me to put this in simpler terms. And it was actually kind of a no-brainer when I started thinking about it, of why I was not communicating their language. On the left was the class I was teaching, groundwater geology. The prereqs are introductory geology and pre-calculus. On the right is Ty's class that I took, which is the class that I was teaching just naturally, which the prereqs are vector calculus, differential equations, and fluid mechanics, right? So it's no wonder that my students looked like this, right? So I came to Ty, and some of you know Chloe Fandel, who's also an alumna of the department, and I said, how about we write a textbook? And we sat in Cafe Luce and we came up with this idea, and now 6 months ago, it's been published. So we wrote a textbook specifically for undergraduate groundwater education. Chloe did the beautiful artwork, and Ty basically helped us not say anything stupid or incorrect. And we came up with this book. And the book's focus is really on quantitative problem solving, analogies, and real world applications. So how can we use things that undergraduates can relate to teach them groundwater? So I'm just going to go through those really quickly and how we do it in the book. So here is a porosity equation, pretty basic. Those of you that are familiar with groundwater or math in general may see this and not think too much of it. You read what the units are and you move on with your life. This is what my students feel like when they see it. They kind of freak out, and they initially, their eyes glaze over and I lose them. And so in the book, we do introduce fundamental equations like this, but using pictures. So here is an exercise that we do in the book. So I do introduce the equations, I do walk them through the units, but then they do an exercise where you have 3 different soil types. We tell them that 1 square is equal to 1 cubic meter, and then we actually have them count, and then tell them that the total volume or the total number of squares is 324, and then they actually count the pore squares. So they go in the book, they count the white spaces, they get an idea of how many squares there are for pore spaces, and then they're able to count from there, calculate the porosity of the soil. And so that really shows them, rather than just tells them what the porosity is of the soil. Then they can conceptually start to do higher order things, like just because you have small grains and small pores doesn't mean you have a small porosity. I know that because I counted all those squares, right? Analogies. So here is a sentence in hydrology that we might not think much of, meaning with the higher hydraulic conductivity has the higher flow rate with the same hydraulic head gradient. Once again, similar sirens go off when I say this to my students. Their eyes glaze over and they say, I have no idea what you're talking about, Melissa. And so it's not that I don't say these things in the book, but I always stop and say, wait, why is that? That was a pretty complicated sentence. Let's break it down. And not only that, I try to use something they can relate to. So rather than diving into hydrologic concepts, I use an analogy they can relate to. So something else that has a gradient, something else that has a conductivity, but something that they can understand. So the gradient of a ramp, if there's a conductivity, there's a higher or there's more a rougher surface, then it's not as conductive and the block doesn't slide down as quickly. Whereas if it's more conductive, it can go down quite quickly. And so breaking it down into something that they can understand and then bringing it back to an equation and giving the more traditional model where you have a soil column and flow rates going through it. So taking that flow rate or the block sliding down the ramp and comparing that to water moving through a porous media. And then the last thing, real world example, we used kind of how can you apply this knowledge more broadly, not just, I don't want you to walk away from a hydrology class and thinking this is all you can do, right? So how can we use in a real world scenario the information you learn from the book and apply it, and what limitations do you have, but also what knowledge do you have really empowers them. And I'll just give you a little bit of student feedback. So when we tried, that frustrated student, when we tried to use a traditional textbook in our classroom, students said it was hard to read through, it was complicated, it was boring, they don't hide their feelings. Math was intimidating. I love this one. I looked at the textbook a total of 1 time. And then, so what I took away from that was, it's not that these aren't amazing books, it's just they're not accessible for undergraduate students. They're way over the head of my students. And so then after using the basics of groundwater, some of the things they say, this is my favorite, keep this. I didn't put this one in the slide because I gave this presentation at GSA last week, but one of the comments was clutter is greater than better. Just say greater than the sign. So I took that as because they really, really liked it. And that students, they didn't feel like it was being dumbed down too much, but they liked the accessible language and the use of visuals and analogies. And there's a need for this. There's a growing number of hydrogeology classes being offered at the undergraduate level. Both Chloe and I are the first hydrogeologists in our departments to ever be hired. And so this is just a graph showing articles that are being published on hydrogeology pedagogy and just the increasing number of classes being offered in hydrogeology. And Fort Lewis College is a great place to practice that. Do I have 2 minutes? Ish. Well, I started 10 minutes late. I will say that. Okay. I like how special Fort Lewis College is. And I think it's really relevant to a lot of people in this room. So Fort Lewis College was an Indian boarding school in the early 1900s. And the reason why the Native American tuition waiver exists is because it was previously an Indian boarding school. And so whenever it transferred over to an educational institution that was not trying to colonize natives, they realized in order to try to kind of make amends for the wrongs of the past, they wanted to offer free tuition for native students. And so when it was a high school, junior college, and now 4-year college, they've stuck by that responsibility to give natives free tuition. And when I was at Fort Lewis College back in 2007 to 2010, I didn't know why I was getting the Native American tuition waiver. It was something that was just swept under the rug. And so there were these panels actually in the clock tower, so that beautiful clock tower you saw at the very beginning, and explains the history of Fort Lewis College. And there's one panel on there that talks about the Indian boarding school, and it makes it sound nice. It makes it sound like this really great place. And so that's kind of part of the sweeping under the rug that I was talking about. And so there's been a big initiative since I've been at Fort Lewis College to try to bring that to surface, not to hide away from our past, but to talk about it. And so there's been a big initiative for truth and reconciliation on campus and talking about the boarding school history. I'm a part of a committee that is really trying to educate people on the tuition waiver, so educate Native students and non-Native students as to why we have the tuition waiver on campus. About 44% of our students on campus are Native. And I was telling them earlier, about a third of them are first generation students. So making this knowledge accessible to the Native students, but also the non-Native students as to why the Native students get free tuition is really important. We've gotten funding from the Sloan Foundation to try to hire more Native faculty, a big NSF grant on how to mentor Native students in STEM. So there's a lot going on campus. I would say it's kind of like the glory days on campus for truth and reconciliation, because there's a lot going on. And that might have been a lot of things to wrap your head around, but I really like it this way. My day is never the same. I'm never bored with my job. Yeah, I'm always doing something new and something different. So, yeah, thanks.
We are open for questions for another few minutes, and then we invite you all to stay for lunch with us.
Are students getting jobs?
They are. The geology department especially, I think because they're community-based research, there's so much where they're almost hired before they even graduate, because they're doing research with local, land owners or agencies. So we have a very high employability going on in the department. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks for that. As you know, I'm sort of a firm believer in the idea that you can't explain something to a person without a map you completely understand.
Yeah. I learned that when I was writing the book.
Cool. So I'm wondering what the thoughts are about actually getting the students to develop the map themselves, rather than having to get that information. It's almost like brain stops. Right? You present the equation. If you be trained,
Yeah.
like gentlemen here, we understand it and trained to use it in the process. If you haven't, it's almost like the brain stops. Right?
Yeah.
I like the counting thing.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could get them to actually define the process. Even to write an equation.
Yeah, I guess I kind of introduced that. I think I just got really excited about the sirens, but I introduced that in the reverse way that we do in the book. We actually do the picture first and then talk about the equation. So conceptually get them to understand the idea and then give them the mathematical tools to do it. So it's actually, that is more of the approach we take in the book.
But I'm curious if you could experiment with actually seeing if we could come up.
The equation. I mean, we should try that in my class. I tell them, don't read page 47 yet.
And I'd love to hear about your experience about it.
Yeah.
Because I really think if, I still feel very uncomfortable with groundwater equations.
Yeah.
Because I was told.
Right.
Someone Milton led me through the process of understanding why.
Yeah. Yeah, that was kind of a lot of my experience when writing the book was, oh, wow, I understand this so much better because I'm trying to explain it without the equation. Yeah. Yeah.
Dr. Chief has a question.
Yeah.
Being that Fort Lewis College has about 48% Native American students, how does it provide opportunities for Native American students to do research or field work with tribes?
Yeah, so that's a big thing. I think bringing making those connections is one of the hardest things, and having those conversations. But for example, I feel like there's almost more research than we have time to do. So when I was doing some research with some students, the Mountain Ute tribe and Mesa Verde wanted to work together to look at spring health in ceremonial waters and looking at how the water quality of those ceremonial waters is being impacted by kind of the greater management of the land. There's a bunch of cattle ranching going on. And so those kinds of things pop up all the time because we are surrounded buy tribal land. Fort Lewis is in the mountains and then just, miles in every direction. There's tribal lands. There's in that community-based research, there's always people coming to Fort Lewis College, knowing we're a Native American serving institution, interested in answering questions. I actually just answered an email today and have a call next week doing just that. So there's always people reaching out. Like I said, it's almost it's a privilege and to my detriment to be the only hydrologist, because water is something in the Southwest there's lots of questions for. So I almost have more calls trying to work with tribes and water issues than I have time.
Oh, okay, one final question.
Yeah. And we can talk afterwards too. Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the college teaching certificate. Like what was the process for getting that and how broadly is it recognized?
Yeah, great. So for a job like Fort Lewis, it's an amazing tool to have because as you know, getting a degree, a Ph.D., you don't learn anything about teaching. So you get this Ph.D. and then you go to apply to somewhere like Fort Lewis and you're like, I know a lot about subsurface hydrology, but I don't know how to communicate it. And so it was, I don't remember, maybe 20 something credits of college teaching, and you pick your courses and they do everything from online, engagement to assessment to how to write lesson plans. So they basically, the idea is if you can walk away with a piece of paper like this, you at least have some foot in the door with education at the college level. So if you're interested in it, it's something I would definitely recommend if you're, especially if you're wanting to go to teaching college, but really if you're gonna be a professor anywhere, you're gonna teach to some level. So it's really valuable.
If offered it at the university, if I was to tell a student, where would they go?
I found it's through the ed department. I think I was just Googling how to get more experience and I noticed those certificate programs and I just looked at the graduate certificate programs on campus and it showed up. So I actually ran into one of the professors I had for a certificate in the hallway. So it's cool for anything.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all for being with us today. Thank you, Dr. Fuller, for traveling into town to be here in person. Thank you, Miguel Flores, for leading us in honoring the life of our minister. Thank you all for your participation. Please stay for lunch. The next Native Voices in STEM seminar is on November 30th. Same bat time, same bat channel. Unfortunately, our speaker had to withdraw, so we are looking for an alternative speaker at this time. So one final thanks to the UA SIGP, the Sloan Graduate Indigenous Partnership, for providing lunch for us today and to pass and Indigifuse and the Indigenous Resilience Center, WRC, and Societal Impact for the co-sponsor.
Thank you.